more to come. Welcome everyone to Show Up Chicago, a community gathering and political panel show presented here monthly at the Hideout. I'm Tom Moss, here with Marge Halpern. We're part of the leadership team of Indivisible, Blue Beginning.
Welcome, everyone. I want to remind you, first of all, that we are streaming live on YouTube, and we are recording the audio for broadcast this Sunday at 7 o'clock on WCPT AM, Chicago's progressive talk station. And for that reason, we will ask you to hold your questions until the end of our hour discussion. We'll be talking with our guest tonight for a sharp hour. And then we will open the floor to questions. So be patient with us. Also, I want to let you know that we are starting with a special treat. I love your response to what TJ Shanoff has done for us so far. And for those who are following us on YouTube or listening to the broadcast on WCPT, you are missing some of the fun that happens here at the Hideout before we begin the recording. So we thought it might be nice to share a little bit of the entertainment that we've all been enjoying for a little while. This is our one-of-a-kind musician and improv comic extraordinaire, TJ Shanoff, who does so much to support us at Indivisible Chicago.
Thank you all. All right. Coming out, everybody.
Anything to plug, TJ?
Anything to plug? I am grateful you're all here. You can follow me on tour with Lucy Darling, the great comedy magician. I'm touring the country with her. And you can listen if you're into the Beatles as described by two really dumb, sometimes high improvisers, tuned to the Untitled Beatles podcast at all Rose Records locations and wherever podcasts are sold. Thank you. Good night.
Rose Records, and you made fun of me for a Doc Severinsen reference.
No, we loved Rose Records, dear to my heart. Well, we're not here to talk about record stores or records. Local record store day is over, I believe. But a municipal charter is our topic. This is a kind of arcane topic for barroom chatter, but we're going to do it because it's one of the most consequential things that Chicago could do to address some of its biggest problems. Think of a charter as a city constitution that lays out the parameters of power, who has it, how it's used, and how accountability is exercised. Chicago doesn't have a charter, has not had one since the 19th century. In fact, of the 25 largest cities in the country, only Chicago and Indianapolis are not governed by a charter. We're in interesting company, I would say, in that way. So why don't we have one? Maybe because we're supposed to have a strong council, weak mayor system. You've probably heard that phrase before, and yet a string of strong mayors have begged to differ. Big Bill Thompson, Ed Kelly, a couple of Dailies, Rahm Emanuel, I'll throw in there, have all enjoyed their political power, whether for a pretty lousy parking meter deal to grab some fast cash and balance an operating budget, or for the pleasure of appointing their own folks to fill aldermanic vacancies, or to prevent citizen referendums. It's easy to see why some say this concentration of power creates an imbalance between the mayor and the city council, maybe I'll throw in, and its residents, leading to dysfunction. There's little transparency or accountability. It prevents progressive change, kind of anti-democratic if we look at it that way, but is it a democratic initiative? That's what we're going to talk about tonight, because one of those strong proponents of a charter is our guest tonight.
Joe Ferguson is a former federal prosecutor, Chicago Inspector General, and current president of the Civic Federation. Widely recognized for his work advancing government accountability, Joe is a principal author and champion of the Chicago Charter Reform effort, which proposes comprehensive changes to strengthen ethics, transparency, oversight, and democratic governance in the city of Chicago. Please join me in welcoming our guest, Joe Ferguson. So maybe let's just start at the beginning with defining our terms. Let's be clear about what a charter is. Can you define a charter? Tell us the top 3 things it would do for Chicago residents that we don't have now.
So hi, everybody. And I did not know I was going to be following Jerry Lee Lewis. But I'll try to bring some energy. Thank you.
Yeah, if you can't see him, he did that with his nose, so.
So look, for all of the challenges that we have right now in this country, all the way down to daily life, behind it all, notwithstanding the fact that we're under stress testing at the legal level, at the constitutional level, and so on and so forth, ours is a constitutional culture. It is in our mindset, it is in our civic DNA, that there is a framework that is enforceable, that, as Marge indicated in her introduction, and really I should be interviewing Marge, is what we should be doing here. Do you want to go?
Yeah.
All right, go ahead. It sets the framework, who has the power, how those powers relate to each other. So, and the feedback loops for that. And fundamentally, in contemporary society, you don't have optimal feedback loops if the citizens, if the people aren't themselves involved, not as a matter of a check-the-box exercise in which the principals, the elected officials, go and do these sort of performative community kind of engagement meetings and sessions, but actually have a requirement of bringing the community feedback back into the legislative process. But quite often, the conversation here, and Marge mentioned of the top 25 cities, and in terms of population, only 2 don't have a charter. Indianapolis kind of has a charter in some respects, and so really it's only Chicago, and to speak from a little bit of kind of the critique and the negative. We have a mayor who is the president, the equivalent of the president and the Speaker of the House at the same time. We all carry with us an understanding of the concept in actual reality, not just in theory, of checks and balances, division of power within government, and a dynamic between the components of government, the separate branches of government. And so when you have somebody who is both the president and the Speaker of the House, you do not have division of power. You have
Just to be clear,
consolidation.
you're describing the mayor and the city council, because you could also be describing the president and the current Speaker of the U.S. House.
Nice call there on that one. Do we actually have a Speaker of the House, a leader of a
think it's
separate
one-
branch of government? And this is
one and
why
the same.
it's one and the same. Yeah. So there are no checks and balances for all intents and purposes, and it's baked into how it is that we operate on a day-to-day level. So what we have is basically a $16 to $17 billion corporation, and by the way, the term charter is used rather than constitution, and Marge is right, it is a constitution that we're talking about, because for municipalities, they derive their authority and their existence from the state in the form of a corporation. The city of Chicago is a corporation, and corporations have charters. That's why the term charter, but when we're talking about a government, it's a constitution.
Okay, that makes sense. It's not like we don't have any governance structure at all, though. We have, as Tom and I kind of looked at this, 3 components, basically. There is the state constitution. State does not have a charter, but they have a constitution. the applicable state laws from that Constitution that govern us. There is the home rule power granted by the state for the city to do some things outside of state law or to be exempt from some, and that creates the municipal code. So we have this patchwork approach to government. Why isn't that enough?
So we have, so the Municipal Code of Chicago ordinances, and we all understand that's basically city law. And then below ordinances, there's regulations, and then there's rules. And then there's also customary practice. And customary practice is really what we carry forward with and we've inherited. And that's why we have a system that actually is structured to the extent that they're structured as a strong council, weak mayor system that ultimately has been captured by mayors dating back to the time of machines. And so the question really is, so why isn't it good enough to have municipal law essentially stand in for what we would refer to as a constitution? Most of municipal law, as it applies to the day in, day out work of government and the legislature, is unenforceable. A constitution is enforceable. And so in best practices, local constitutions, municipal constitutions, county constitutions, they generally have a provision called what's referred to as private attorneys general, in which any of us, if the government is actually not operating in accordance with the Constitution, can file a suit, and the essence of the suit is to get a judge to say, public official, you actually have to do what the Constitution says. Ordinances don't work that way. Most of them are unenforceable.
So we see what you just described as what is helping our democracy hang by a thread at the moment, because everyone's filing suit to support the Constitution despite what the president is doing. So if there's a local ordinance that's not being followed, we don't have the ability to push back.
We have very little ability to push back, and it can be changed on the fly. Give an example of that. When some years ago, during the Emanuel administration, and I'm not picking on any one mayor, I may say examples more from one administration than another, but all mayors, and actually on this front, let's just sort of do the equal time thing up front. The most fervent advocates for a municipal constitution until 3 years ago were people from the DSA, from the progressive left. And as soon as they attained power in City Hall, that was it. They were done with that. And the most vocal advocates for it right now are the people that generally within Chicago's political terms are associated with the right, okay? We'll have an election, at least at the municipal level, in the course of the next year. The vast majority of the candidates will say they are for a municipal constitution. And whoever gets elected, probably the day they take office, will no longer be quite so enthused about that. Because in order to do this, essentially what we're effectuating is a shift in the traditional balance of power, taking power away from the mayor. But for this enforceability provision, give you an example. So when Rahm Emanuel was picking a police chief, Eddie Johnson was the person who would be picked. There was, by ordinance, a process for doing a nationwide search and recommendations being made, and the mayor puts up from the 3 people nominated the person who he's asking the city council to confirm for the position, and it requires city council confirmation. Rahm didn't like the 3 people that were served up to him, so he went to the city council and said, can we just suspend the law for 30 days? And then it will automatically take effect, go back into effect 30 days later, and in that 30-day window, he basically just named a person who did not apply for the job at all. And then the city council confirmed that person. You can change ordinances on the fly. You can't change constitutions on the fly, and none of us can file a lawsuit saying, hey, you didn't follow the ordinance.
Because there would be no one to file a lawsuit with, right? There's no standing.
Right.
All right, so I think we're getting a pretty good sense of charter as a constitution. I want to take a step back. You mentioned home rule. We talked about that as one of the three components. Can you talk about that a little bit? What is home rule? Where did it come from? How does it work in practice?
So, in short, home rule is a conferral of discretion and authority on a locality that the state itself hasn't occupied through constitutional prescription or through legislation. And in Illinois, there are some localities, local governments that have home rule powers. Chicago is one of those. And that means the government can do lots and lots of things. If the state level government has legislated in a specific area in a way that says only we can legislate, the home rule authority can do nothing. But if it's left open and it doesn't violate a broader constitutional principle, the locality can act. And so, with respect to all sorts of things regarding, for instance, public safety, that's broad latitude for the locality here. So anyway, it is not a blank check, but it is a broad range of authority that's left to the locality to decide for itself, and presumably the people are involved in that process of legislating in those spaces, but it's a broad space to work within.
So one example, we had a session last month on Build Illinois, which did not pass the legislature, but had it passed, it would have set blanket zoning laws for the entire state, including home rule jurisdictions, with the governor and others saying, Chicago, elsewhere, you're not creating enough affordable housing, enough middle housing fast enough. We're going to set new zoning laws that say you have to allow them in places where you don't currently allow them. And the home rule jurisdictions rose up together and basically stopped the bill. But that's an example, right?
Exactly right. Something that the state previously left to the localities to decide. The governor endeavored to legislate as a prescriptive matter that dictates the terms and limits the authority of the localities. It did not pass. But that's exactly it. And so basically it would have taken away the home rule latitude and authority of the localities as it relates to that specific type of regulation.
So maybe a little story time. Thinking about maybe its alternate history too, a real world example, some situation, maybe it's the parking meters, maybe it's the Bears Stadium. I don't know what. I don't want to feed you too much here. But how did an issue play out or is currently playing out that would have been or would be now different if we had a charter in place?
So let's talk about the parking meters, because actually it's a live issue, because there's a proposal to sell the contract to a new entity, and under the terms of that of the parking meters deal, the city council must approve the transfer of the contract to the new entity. But let's go into the Wayback Machine when the parking meters deal was originally passed. So first, obviously, we're talking about a major city asset that relates to the operations of the streets, that relates to public order in all sorts of ways. There's a revenue component of it, and we basically sold a 75-year lease, which, for all intents and purposes, for all of us here, equals in perpetuity of this valuable asset. How did that come about? There actually was a competitive bid process, but it was not public-facing in a significant way. It was significantly opaque. The city had control of it. They received bids. They decided who the winning bidder was. They negotiated a contract with the winning bidder that they had selected, and Mayor Daley presented it to the city council on a Friday. It was approved on a Tuesday, the following Tuesday. And so first let's talk about what happened there. This incredibly complex thing with a huge history behind it and complex financial analysis and vetting. City council did not have a chance to do that. Scott Wagasback is the only sitting member of the city council right now, today, who I believe voted against it. And it was simply, we shouldn't be voting for something we don't understand and we haven't gotten the information on. And in Chicago, the city council does not have a right to information. The only thing they can do is withhold a vote that they actually have approval authority of. That's it. It's all or nothing. They don't have a right to the information that's held by the executive branch, meaning the mayor. They don't have the power to subpoena it. They don't have the power to actually put people in a witness stand and have them swear an oath and speak truthfully. On the executive branch side, the employees of the city, the officials of the city, they have no obligation to cooperate with the city council with respect to any information. So think about that in the context of budgeting every year, year in, year out. So the city council basically has to rely upon the kindness of a frenemy to give what information it might want and it might need in order to make an informed decision. And if the mayor says no, no more, which is usually what mayors do, that's it. And so they have a decision to make, to just say no altogether until they get the information, which interestingly is what's happening with respect to this question of whether or not the parking meters contract will go to this new entity, venture capital firm from the East Coast. How would this work in other cities? Let's go to New York, which has a constitution, a charter. Major sale of a city asset, huge amount of value to it with huge financial consequence. First off, there would have to be a vote from the city council to approve a procurement process for the possible selling of this. There have to be an approval up front by the legislature that, yeah, we're willing to consider this. Second, when the city actually decides who it would want to deal with, if this were New York City, first place that this would go is to into an independent adjuncted arm of the city council, the independent budget office, which is like, for those of you that know the Washington way, the congressional budget office, which is where the legislature sends absolutely everything to be scored, to be vetted for its significance, as a comparative matter and on its own terms. That would get reported out publicly, and the information and the report sent to the city council. The city council then would have time and capacity to independently analyze the work of the IBO, the Independent Budget Office, and probably hold hearings on it, and then have a vote. And all of this is laid forth in procedures that are tied to the Constitution. But the leasing of such a valuable asset, which is a city asset, probably would have had to go to referendum after the city council said yes. And so you have full knowledge, you have access to all the information, you have the analysis that you need, you have engagement of the legislative branch, a vote from the legislative branch, and then a vote by the people for something that's major. You wouldn't want to have all of this process for absolutely everything, because government the gears would get gummed up, but it would be very different looking, and I'm quite sure the parking meter deal would not have been passed in the first instance.
Not in that form, anyway.
Absolutely.
It would seem, yeah. So I have a question that I feel like your example answers some, but I would love to hear a summarial answer. Creating a charter does change the roles of the city council and aldermanic power. How does it affect some of the things the council is enjoying now? Aldermanic privilege, the power of committees. They get something they don't like, they shuffle it off to rules, and you'll never see it again, which is what happened to a proposal that was introduced last year for a charter, shunted off directly, to rules. They know how to shut things down. So does the council give up some powers to get others, or how does the mix affect our alders, who are our direct representatives?
So aldermanic privilege has all sorts of applications, and in some respect, it would be cabined and channeled to things of, I'm going to take a step back here. So, because there's some structural things that explain why we're in this fix that a constitution would address. I mentioned at the start that the mayor is the equivalent of the president and the speaker of the House. The mayor presides over the city council. What presiding means actually isn't defined under the law. It's actually left to the home rule authority, meaning the city council, to do that, but the city council has never defined what it means to preside, which means that there's a void. Nature abhors a vacuum. Mayors abhor vacuums. The mayor takes the power unless the city council slaps the hand and says no. That simply doesn't happen generally until recent times. Okay, because the mayor presides, because the mayor is essentially the speaker of the House, the mayor also functionally, with the corporation council sitting next to him, as he stands with the gavel, is the parliamentarian. So that means any procedural action that's taken on any matter is largely decided from the dais, the mayor, the presiding body. If there's any dispute, that's largely decided what is appropriate and not appropriate by Corporation Counsel or the Corporation Council's second. Okay. If we don't want something to happen, we are the mayor, you are the mayor. If you don't want something to happen, the first thing that happens when legislation is introduced is it gets referred to committee. Because the mayor is the presiding officer, the mayor essentially decides which committee. There are all sorts of things that have logical places to lodge and submit legislation. If it relates to the streets, it goes to transportation, so on and so forth, right? If you don't want it to go anywhere, you send it to rules first, where it's going to sit for 60 days at least, and may sit there forever unless some alderman actually knows what's known as Rule 41 and knows how to dislodge it from that committee and put it back into the slipstream, but it delays everything right there. But even if it went to one of the regular subject matter committees, who are the chairs of those committees? Allies of the mayor. Why? It's the city council's committee structure, and that is where in proper functioning legislative bodies, true legislative oversight occurs. Real policy is made, real vetting is done of legislation that's coming from the executive branch. Here, we've acquiesced for decades to the mayor to select the people who head the committees that are supposed to do the oversight of the mayor. And who does the mayor select? His allies. So, this is all a closed circle.
Sounds like a Politburo more than a council.
Well, you know, in Chicago, you know, until recently, we tended to elect people of sort of authoritarian leanings of a sort, and it kind of did function like the Politburo in many respects. But again, understand it's by acquiescence. The city council actually could occupy a lot of this space. It hasn't done so. And then who historically has decided when those committees meet, what's on the agenda of those committees, who the witnesses are? It's the mayor's office.
Or the chairman.
Or the chairman. It's the chairman
Same
who,
thing.
who basically is the proxy for the mayor's office.
Yeah.
So it sounds like this is less about ideology and more about power. Surprise, surprise. We mentioned how the power of the council and the power of the mayor might evolve under a charter. But a lot of power is also exerted by the FOP, by the police union, by the CTU, the teachers union. How might that power change under a charter?
So all collective bargaining agreements are contracts that have to be approved by the city council. They take the form of ordinance, so they got to go through this process. And then the question is, okay, who's vetting these things to actually understand their impact? We'll go through the same sort of process and analysis, and you probably would have actual hearings on that. I'll give you an example of why that can matter in really major ways. The water department. The water department operates under 17 separate collective bargaining agreements. There are more than 1,400 time codes for employees. The only people who actually know how to play the levers of all of those time codes is the unions, right? Too complex. But when these contracts get submitted to the city council for approval, is there any discussion, is there any analysis about whether or not this is any way to run a railroad, if you will? That simply doesn't happen. So with respect to a charter, the politics with respect to unions and collective bargaining agreements wouldn't change, but these things would be vetted, and we would understand the impact, pros and cons, front end, especially the financial components of it, because they're laws just like anything else.
I'm pausing because you brought up the water department. Nothing's ever gone wrong with the water department, so
No.
we have to worry about that. But we'll leave that for another conversation. But one of the things we do think about is this mayor has, in my opinion, and you spoke about the difference between the left and the right, and so I think a lot of people in this room could agree with me. Mayor has a lot of great ideas that would help the city. What he doesn't have is enough money to fund them. So We have the pension obligations, which were rushed through in ways that were not vetted the way you said, 35 billion or whatever it is now. The infrastructure needs, housing crisis, we already mentioned. CTA is, we've got a new solution for transportation. We'll see how that works. But all these problems need money. So will the charter help make revenue flow or will direct revenue in a more efficient way? How will that change the financial troubles of our city, if at all?
So first off, what a charter would do, the first rule when you find yourself in a hole, stop digging. And to simply have budgetary standards, accounting standards, reporting standards, and a process in which we pass budgets not on the basis of an introduction in October of a budget, with historically a 2-week period, maybe a 3-week period where we have hearings, and in those hearings, for most aldermen, it's the only time they see most of the commissioners of most of the departments, and mostly what they want to talk about. And actually, I'll go to a memory that stays with me. The very first time I had to go up and quote unquote defend the proposed budget for the Inspector General's office at the beginning of time, I immediately was following animal care and control. And I had to wait for 3 hours because a lot of aldermen wanted to talk about raccoons.
Hey, my house was invaded by a raccoon. It's a touchy subject, but okay. I'm glad my alderman was up there talking about it.
But a few years ago at the University of Chicago at the Harris School, I had students basically do a non-scientific review of the budget processes here and in Los Angeles. And here, we spend 12% of our budget hearings actually talking about the budget. Los Angeles was about 78%, okay? In Los Angeles, the hearings take a month and there's multiple phases. This is pursuant to a constitution. Here, the hearings are 2 to 3 weeks. Put aside last year, distinct where that goes, we could talk about or not talk about, but what happens is this massively complex document that's incredibly long, that isn't analyzed, for which the council itself doesn't have the resources internally to do the analysis, for which there isn't an independent budget office to do the analysis. What happens is this largely passes without real scrutiny. And what the result typically is what is a technically balanced budget, meaning the right side of the ledger and the left side of the ledger at a single moment in time are in equilibrium and balance, but in point of fact, it's on the basis of fuzzy accounting quite often, estimates of revenue that really haven't been probed sufficiently, under standards that, accounting standards and budgeting standards that don't comport with best practices nationally. So there is no specific law on this. And when I say the right side and the left side are in equilibrium on a specific day, I do mean a specific day. If the budget is out of balance the day after it's been passed, they've passed the balanced budget. That's all that they need to do. We're watching some of that play out right now. The quote-unquote alternate budget of the city council that was what was passed was about 98.5% of what the mayor proposed in the first instance. Not really an alternate at all. Why is that? City council doesn't have the resources, doesn't have access to the information to actually be able to dig in and do more of what it wishes it could do. But in all of that, there were estimates that the city council itself forwarded for revenue streams, which the administration at the front end said, those are unrealistic, and immediately after said, we're basically already in a deficit situation days into the new year, right? All of this is because there are no standards, there are no guardrails, there are no requirements in New York. And not that any one city has figured it all out. Cities are the hardest thing to actually govern and administer. Why is that? Because cities are left with, with this foundation of multi-generational disinvestment, discrimination, and so on and so forth, disempowerment. They're left to deal with the problems, the intractable multi-generational problems of what happens when capitalism is not required to capture the externalities and the inequities of how it goes about things. It's left with cities to figure that out. It's actually very hard to be a big city mayor. And so if you don't have standards as you're digging into all of this that actually bound you to reliable numbers, most of the time what you're dealing with is structural deficits, even though the budget is technically balanced. And it usually includes things like refinancing debt so that you can generate money short-term for purposes of operating expenses immediately. Borrowing, so in the last budget, the one that was passed as the alternate budget, the city council approved borrowing, issuing bonds to pay for the firefighters' contract, the back pay on the firefighters' contract, to pay for judgments and settlements that far exceed what we all know is an understated line in budgets year in and year out, mostly driven by historical police misconduct matters, and we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars there. But those things are borrowing now for operating costs today that we pay down the road. And the way that we go about that borrowing itself doesn't comport with standards that would exist under a constitution that would actually preclude doing things that we've been doing lately, which is to pass bond issuances in which we don't start servicing the debt on that bond. We only we pay nothing for a couple years, as long as 5 years, and then we only pay interest, leaving the principal for many years downstream, and don't start paying the principal for 20 years. And the debt piles up and piles up.
So all these things are interesting and potential elements. Let's move on to how do we get this charter that I think we might all want. It might come with a municipal income tax too, so we should be careful, I guess, maybe a little bit about what we wish for. So how would a Chicago charter be created? I understand there will be a commission, but devil's in the details. Who decides who the commission is?
Who decides whether there's a commission and who the commission is? So under the state constitution, there's actually 3 ways of going about this. It's not prescribed. It's just what is allowed under this sort of broad ambit right now. 3 ways of going about it. Actually, this is the Spanish Inquisition skit of Monty Python, because there's actually. Thank you. There's actually 4 ways of going about it. One is the mayor could initiate a charter commission. Second is the city council could initiate a charter commission. Third is the people by referendum could initiate a charter commission, so long as the authority exists under the law, and it's not expressly clear under the law right now that this can happen, and that I expect to change in the near term. And the 4th way is for the state legislature to actually create a commission. And in the first instance, so two of those sources that I mentioned are elected officials who would be creating a charter that ostensibly would lack legitimacy at the front end, because the very people who it would affect would be the ones that are actually creating it and then probably controlling it, which gets to the other issue, is who's on a charter commission. And so what I expect we'll actually all be reading about and hearing about in the coming months is legislation that, in the first instance, an inaugural commission would be created by the state. The members of the commission would be elected. All right?
Elected by city residents.
By city residents, added to all the other elected positions that exist in Chicago.
Move over school board.
That gets into its own Game of Thrones version of things. But in the first instance, it comes into existence, and we elect who the commission members are. The legislation at the state level would define certain aspects of process to make sure, and I'll give you an example of New York City, where there was a hard reset on the form of government done in the late 80s and early 1990s. They had 400 community hearings, and all of that was of record, and it was poured into the commission, and the commission was required to actually account for all of those inputs. Similar in Los Angeles, which did a hard reset of its government in 2000. These are modern. Not to call anybody out, I have gray hair, but if you have gray hair, this is modern times. We're not talking about men in powdered wigs 250 years ago, right? So this can be done, and in point of fact, it is done all the time. It's not only, as Marge said, that we're the only major city without a constitution. The National Civic League is on its ninth model charter. Going back over 100 years. Its sixth edition of guidance for charter commissions. And so there are basic elements of procedure in terms of best practices, in terms of public participation, in terms of accountability, probably who is elected and how we draw up those districts, probably will map over how we've drawn up the districts for purposes of electing a school board in the coming cycle. And so there will actually be geographic diversity. There would need to be appointed a permanent staff, basically an executive director and staff, to do all of the technical work underlying it and supporting the commission. But it's people first. People first, people during, people after, because the recommendations that come out of a charter commission, and this is required by the state constitution, we're talking about basically making a proposal for the form of government, and if it's a proposal for the form of government for a locality, the people of the locality have to vote on it and pass it by referendum.
Is it to be determined the structure of that commission? I mean, would there be a member from each ward? Would it be a 10-person committee, a tribunal? What would it be?
So that's probably going to be a discussion in the state legislature as to how big the commission should be. But my mention of school districts, we basically have the city divided into 10 districts for purposes of school board elections that are coming. In the school board, there'll be 2 people from each district and then 1 person who's elected across the city as the president. We could do something like that with respect to a charter commission, but you don't want to have 20 people, that many people. This is a really complex, deliberative process that we're going to go through that would have to be done in a short amount of time. 10 people seems like a good number.
So if you were running the show, it would be around 10.
10's a nice number.
But how do you know it isn't going to be run like, say, the elections for Democratic committeemen, where the elected officials put themselves into those slots and they're well-known, name recognition, they get elected? Or even how our maps are drawn in the first place, that by ward, whoever gerrymanders or decides how to develop our wards, we get representation, but it's not all equal. I could just see 10 ways that we've run public elections that were not very democratic.
There are more ways that this can go wrong than right. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it.
I'm beginning to understand.
And democracy is very messy, and especially in Chicago, if we call it a democracy, it's especially messy. But what we have are a dividing of the city into 10 districts already accepted, right? Mm-hmm. Created not as a result of gerrymandering. And on the subject of gerrymandering, one of the things that the city council has the power to do under the existing framework, and this probably would be something that would very much be a subject for a charter commission, is the city council draws up its own ward map and then approves it, right? Marge has a pretty good story about how her neighborhood is divided, but actually some of this is done in ways, obviously, that are self-serving to the alderman. It also tends to be done in ways that result in most of the wards of the city essentially being monocultures, one ethnicity or race, not a lot of socioeconomic diversity within it, and the alders literally say, I want that house, I want that block, so on and so forth. And if you're in the majority, you probably get all of those things that you want, so that you have a district that actually meets your best outcome in terms of prospects for re-election. That's the sort of thing that a charter would say, no, that needs to be an independent charter commission. Maybe we do things like having publicly funded campaign finance rules. That Matt Martin some years ago introduced an extraordinarily broad-reaching proposal. That's the sort of thing in many cities around the country that is written into the Constitution. So those are the sort of things that actually can sort of balance the capacity of the vested interests, the status quo, the power brokers, from capturing the process. All of your questions, Marge, really are about capture, that preclude fairness, equity, access, that in so many ways, you guys all know why we have elections in wintertime, right? It's because turnout is low and that favors incumbents. That's the sort of thing that would be changed to.
Voter suppression in Chicago?
Voter suppression in Chicago.
Yeah. So of the other 23, excluding Indianapolis, major cities, Who should we be looking to? Should we be looking to New York for guidance, or LA, or Houston, or Seattle? What's our model?
So everyone does it differently because the prompt for it is different. Quite often, the prompt for it or for a revision has to do with some major scandal or some aspect of government that really has failed us all. And everyone has their own version of it, and everybody has their own sort of version of imperatives coming from the people up. But places to look. So my feeling is you're probably in fantasy land if you're looking at smaller cities and jurisdictions. So I could say to everybody, go look at how Austin runs, Austin, Texas. We're not Austin, Texas. We have a whole bunch of different issues, right? I would say you go to the bigger cities. We look to New York, and is everything done well in New York? Absolutely not. When Zoran Mamdani was elected mayor, there was a whole lot of hand-wringing about what that would mean, okay? All sorts of things he wanted to do, all sorts of things that he ran on. A lot of it, out of the gate, he absolutely wasn't going to be able to do. Why? There's a constitution that says there are certain things you have the unilateral power to do, and certain things you have to go to the legislature for, and certain things you would have to go to the people for by referendum, right? But I say New York because they have a charter or constitutional culture going back to the late 19th century. They've tried all sorts of things. They've gone through the process in modern times of actually hitting reset when there were aspects of how government operated that were deemed to be unconstitutional, deemed to violate one person, one vote, deemed to be not serving the people in some critical respect. As part of that, a capacity to amend the Constitution regularly. And there's different ways of going about that. So in Portland, Oregon, there's a possibility of amending the charter, individual referendum for individual provisions, but every 10 years, there's a charter revision commission, and they look at how things are running. And there is, again, a citizen-based, citizen-inclusive process. And Portland, a couple years ago, actually hit a significant reset on its processes. But in New York City, there is no such thing as a municipal election that does not have a question on the ballot to amend the charter in some ways. And quite often, for those who lean progressive, and I'm guessing most of the people in this room lean progressive, that's quite often the place where things that we really should be engaging, but because of political conflict, we don't quite get to in the legislature, or because of how elections, who actually can finance and get their people into office, they end up in the charter as forms of government where critical things like environmental impact issues actually have to be put through a semi-independent body that's part of city government, that's constituted of people like us. But the broader point here is New York has an active culture with a core government structure that we would all recognize, that's consonant with our values, that is inclusive, and that has the capacity to change and evolve with our needs over time.
I love your references to what progressives or conservatives might want out of government, and you said almost at our open that whoever's in power wants to leave everything the way it is, then once they're out of power, they don't like it and they'd like to change it. If we don't understand that after this Trump 2.0, then we're not paying attention.
Stephen Miller should want to be mayor of Chicago based on his view of power.
Ouch. Thank you for that punctuation, TJ. Yeah, right.
So where should we move then? Would it be to New York?
So really, the question is, we could have put limits on power under Obama or Biden, in between Trumps, but we didn't because we thought we were handling things fine as progressive Democrats. But now I think, to me, the lesson is you don't know who the next president or mayor will be, and given the fact that we don't have ranked choice voting, which was a topic we addressed here in the past, this free-for-all with a dozen different candidates, or however that's going to turn out, gives you a runoff that could be two people, you don't want either of them, but you're stuck. It's a crapshoot who is going to be our next mayor when we have this system. So is this the right moment, even though we might, as progressives, we like the things this mayor wants to do, but we don't know what's going to happen in 27. Is that the argument you would make?
Absolutely. So there's no such thing as 20-year mayors anymore for Chicago. That's done. That provided some form of stability, but there's lots of problems that go along with that. We're now in a world here and elsewhere, maybe not in Washington, I hope in Washington, where we have 1- and 2-term executives, right? And that's it. And some of them are going to be good, and some of them are going to be really bad. And the good ones may be constrained a little bit in what they could do that we want them to do, but they would be constrained only to the extent that they did not engage the legislative branch in the service of coming up with the best and the most for everybody, right? The really bad ones, they could do less harm. Again, go back to what do you do when you're in a hole? Stop digging, right? And because the pendulum swings, because we're going to have good mayors and bad mayors, because we're going to have people who know how government runs leading the city, and some who are literally learning as they go. And we've had, I don't want to get political or judgmental, but we've had 2 straight mayors who actually had to learn as they went. And the real question is, wonderful people, well-intentioned. The real question is, how do they respond to failure? How do they respond to resistance? Do they learn? Do they acknowledge the mistakes? And what systems do and structures do provide that feedback loop with the accountability that actually elevates issues in a way where we're not all, like at the White Sox game, with the 3 hats and the 1 ball trying to figure out which hat the ball is under. We all know what's going on. It elevates accountability. But yeah, that's absolutely right. We don't know what's coming. And so we actually want to assure that the road itself, because we're going to veer into the breakdown lane, we may go off roads at time, but generally that we're mostly on the road and the core elements are sound. And we can argue about all the other stuff, all of those political issues, all the ideological issues, knowing that we're really actually centered on the main road, and that's where we want to be. Why? Both for the consequences now, but for the consequences of our children in the future.
I do want to call out one aspect because there is a constituency behind the charter movement, primarily because they want to recall this mayor and have wanted to recall some other mayors they didn't like. And I'm understanding the shorthand that if we get a charter, we're going to have recall. I don't believe that is necessarily a part of it. I would hope it's not part of it. I think recalls are very disruptive. If I don't like the mayor, ask me again later. But at the moment, it does feel to me, we saw what happened in California. We saw it before in Wisconsin. The recall process is a continual election, and it's very disruptive.
And expensive.
I would hate to see that be part of a charter. Are those people who say we need a charter so we can recall the mayor jumping ahead a little bit? Is that not?
They're jumping ahead, and there's lots of people who, as this issue gets elevated, who want to pursue it for a specific outcome, a specific component. There are people who would say campaign finance, we need it for that. There are people who would say ranked choice voting, we need it for that. All of these things can be in a charter. That's not what this is about. This is about the relationship of the people to their government and the government to the people, and the feedback loops within a standard-based system that has transparency components and accountability components. That changes, and frankly, I'll say something that may sound offensive in some respects. We need to change in all of this as well. We actually have a transactional relationship with our city. We want garbage cans. We want pickup. We want special pickup when we want to toss out a couch or a mattress, right? Those days have to be over, and we have to stop thinking about the city in terms of what transactionally we want or desire from the city, and more in terms of what our relationship is, whether we have voice, whether there's full participation, whether there's acknowledgement of our needs, whether there's accountability and responsiveness to what it is that we need over time, and change government itself. Right now, we have the 50 mini-mayor system, and there's a generational component of this as well. Younger or less experienced people coming into the city council think they're coming to be legislators. They're not. Most offices run as constituent service offices, and we need to get to a place where, and going back to how it is that districts are drawn and the monocultures there are very few aldermen that actually have diverse wards that require them to think in terms of competing, sometimes antagonistically competing interests, and elevate themselves above special interests, above hyper-localized interests, although carrying the perspective of people on the ground level to what is in the best interests of the city, and get us all to be thinking what is in the best interests of the city, and to get us all to be thinking about whether or not the things that we want transactionally from our government is something that the city actually can deliver in a way that's affordable to us. It changes the entire dynamic of the relationship. That's what a charter should be about.
For an arcane topic, this has been fascinating, and we could talk for quite a while. We're about out of time for our broadcast portion, but I did want to ask one last question. What's the timing? What's next? What are the next steps?
So this is being discussed in some quarters in Springfield, and there is some prospect of legislation that actually has been filed, being fine-tuned and brought forward in the coming months, where we may have legislative hearings here in Chicago between now and the veto session in the fall. Why the veto session in the fall for actually doing this? That would, if this were passed in a way where it was created by the state as an inaugural matter, and then we would have an election, it would take us out of this notion that it's being done in response to any one leader, any one mayor, any one political regime, as it were, and elevate it above that, take it out of an election cycle. And so I think that question is going to be emerging, and coupled with the fact that we're going to head into a municipal election cycle. In some ways, it's already started.
We already have announced candidates.
We have announced candidates, and it will be an issue as this is being thought about in Springfield, whether it's the veto session, whether it's the lame duck session. That will sort of be the first crack at this. And if that were the case and the first commission were in fact elected, the election would be, I think, in November of 2028. So there's a runway here to get at that. By the way, in 2028, there will be another referendum question on everybody's ballots when they vote, and that is whether or not we need a new constitutional convention for the state. Every 10 years, that's an automatic question, and there's all sorts of things where I expect the conversation about constitutions to be a major thing here in Illinois.
I was going to bring up the Constitutional Convention. One fast question. Any idea where the governor stands on this?
Can I have some music, please? Thank you. The governor's a lawyer. The governor is raised in the same constitutional culture. I suspect the governor would not take any position on this at all, but I also think the governor wouldn't stand in the way of it. The governor's general modus operandi is to allow the state legislature to actually work these things out, and if it's a good idea that the state legislature thinks is a good idea, then the governor would sign it. But I don't expect the governor to step into Chicago politics beyond the current brickbats going back and forth between him and the mayor around the Bears. I said Bears.
We'll see if you're right. We'll see if you're right. I'm not sure the governor is as restrained as you're saying, but if he's running for president, there might be an incentive to be a little restrained.
It's hard to be against good government, and that's what we're talking about here.
All right.
Well, with that, we'll close down the broadcast portion of our show by saying Show Up Chicago is hosted by Blue Beginning Chapter of Indivisible Chicago, as well as our friends here at the Hideout Inn. You and your absent friends can watch this all over again at YouTube. Just search for Blue Beginning. Welcome to the new owner of the Hideout, Terry O'Brien, and thanks to the always helpful owners Emeriti, Tim and Kami. Tim, I'll edit this. Tim and Katie Tutton. Special thanks to the terrific staff at the Hideout Inn, especially Jody Boltman, Alex York, Kwame Caldwell, and our always smiling bartenders who deserve your tips, so stick around and make sure that happens. Tonight's sound engineer here at the Hideout is Jonas Standerfer. John Freeberg manages our broadcasting and recording. Thanks to Lewis University for additional support. Thanks to WCPT for broadcasting Show Up Chicago the following Sunday each month at 7 p.m. Thanks to the Blue Beginning team, who, in addition to Marge and me, includes Chloe Madvig, Maureen Kuhl, Nick Rabkin, and Mike Lenahan. That's TJ Shanoff over there on the keyboard, appearing every other Friday at the Ivanhoe Theater. One more big round of applause for our guest, Joe Ferguson, and thank you so much. See you next month. All right, Mike, do you want to manage?
There's a new organization in Chicago called A More Just Chicago. Is that an effort to get public support for the charter movement?
So I'm on the board, so I'm familiar with the organization. That is an organization whose mission is actually to activate civic engagement. And it is chosen as its first project, organizing, educating around a charter. And so, yeah, it's part of this sort of emerging effort that exists right now.
All right, thank
Mike,
you.
I think I saw a hand back
There's
here in
one
the
in
center aisle.
Yep.
Towards the end of the discussion, you referenced the 50 princes and princesses that we have.
I said mini mayors. I didn't say princes or princesses.
I'll take the term. I'll take the term myself. That's
It is a somewhat feudal, feudal
Bowers,
arrangement. There you
perhaps.
go.
Okay, good. So do you see this as, because I've also read some arguments on, that we should be moving towards a more centralized as opposed to a decentralized system, and that's one of the fundamental flaws that we have. So do you see, from an order of operations standpoint, as the charter first and then get rid of 80% of them, and go towards more of a New York type model where you might have smaller amounts and then some like alder people at large, or the other way around?
So the number of city councilors in New York, 51. But they elect a president. They have their own individual capacities. There's pros and cons to larger numbers and smaller numbers. It's easier to get things done with smaller numbers. It's messier the bigger the numbers that you have, but the bigger the numbers that you have, the more representative it can actually be. The problem is that our form of representation tends to map over ethnic and racial and socioeconomic divides that exist. And so it's really about going about this differently, but that's the sort of thing for which the people themselves should actually be deciding what is the right number. The number of aldermen has changed over the course of the history of the city, going back to 1837, 2037. It's 11 years out. It's the bicentennial of the city. We're going to build that city now for the future with the people who will lead it then. And charter is a great way of having a conversation about what city that we want to be. But there's pros and cons to it, but how you get to that 50, say in I think it was in 1923 that we changed from 75 to 50. What kind of democracy and how representative do we want it to be, and how do we want to go about drawing those districts? Those are core charter questions.
Another one back behind you, Mike.
Hi. So talking about constructing a charter, one of the more liable solutions you presented was electing commissioners. But in a time where, trust in elected officials is at an all-time low, from the city to the state to the nation, how can people trust that a charter would serve their best interests without direct, consistent input from normal, everyday people? Because now, we'll vote somebody into a position, we'll cross our arms, and we'll say, okay, I hope you do what I voted for.
So, really important question. A couple of things here. Reference was made, previous question, to a more just Chicago. That's the very reason why it is engaged in organizing and outreach and education right now, is to actually elevate, and its core model is to identify leading figures within the 77 neighborhoods of the city to actually be ambassadors and advocates, but go into the community and actually work with folks in community to make sure those inputs are drawn into the process. Second, if a charter commission is drawn up correctly in terms of its responsibilities, there has to be hearings, there has to be feedback loops, there has to be a demonstration that specific inputs that are received from the people are reflected through hearings and through actual deliberations. But your question about elections and electing people and the legitimacy of that elected officials have, this is not a charter. A commission that's formed is not a permanent government entity. It is formed for the purpose of actually going through this exercise. And so people hold office for a very discrete period of time, probably 2 years, and that's it. There is no reelection. There is no continuing thing. There is a means of actually charging the recreation of a charter commission and therefore requiring new people to be selected, but it's not a permanent form of government. It's actually folks that are being elected for this specific purpose. How do we know that they're actually doing what we elect them to do? Again, by the standards, I mentioned the National Civic League, there are standards for this. This all has to be out in the open and transparent with this accountability and these feedback loops. If the organizing and the outreach and the engagement is done on the front end to actually have people involved, those people then are actively involved in the deliberations and the input of what goes into the charter, and those same people are actually the foundation for what eventually would be a referendum to determine whether or not the recommendations of the charter should be accepted in the form of a new form of government for the city of Chicago.
Yeah, it still doesn't sound like everyday people like having a way or access to input their say into a city charter. So I think, having something like a civic assembly have a say in writing a charter, and also having a civic assembly empower a city charter.
So
assembly.
so the mention of a civic assembly, there's an organization, I actually asked Marge if she knew she ever met Harry Gottlieb, and Unify America is an entity that was established by Harry Gottlieb that actually specifically is engaged in, and they're doing sort of the practice work for this in another part of the country, and it's coming to Chicago, civic assemblies. And there's a question that exists out there as to whether or not the civic assembly actually, which is a localized means of engaging citizens in real dialogue, longitudinally, I think there's a real question as to whether that actually may be the means by which we engage all of that. Point well taken.
We have one behind you, Mike, and then a couple back over to the side.
Yeah, real quick, I guess I understood that Chicago once had at least pieces of a charter and that dissipated over time. I was just curious what that history was, and also whether there's good examples across the state of other communities we look to as models for charters.
There aren't great examples across the state. There are other. There's about 20 or so localities that actually operate with some form of charter, but the localities. If I said this, I apologize for repeating it. Localities get their authority from the state in the form of a corporation. There has to be a charter for the corporation. So when the city of Chicago was formed in 1837, it was pursuant to a charter. That charter evolved maybe 5 or 6 times during the 19th century. And similar things happened across the country. In the early 20th century, literally 1904 to 1907, there was essentially a charter commission that existed that actually did the work and brought forward in the form of a referendum changing the form of government of Chicago. it did not pass by referendum. It was the same sort of factions and specialized interests competing with each other. And this was happening across the country. Chicago was one of the only cities that did not move with the times. And in essence, our culture, our language, our consciousness withered with respect to charters and constitutions. If you ask most people whether they were aware of what Marge said, Chicago is one of the only major cities in the country without a constitution, the answer is no, I had no idea. Why? It's not part of our civic history, culture, language, not part of our discourse at all. And so to your question of what happened to it, it just withered.
All right, we have another question behind you, Mike.
So sort of piggybacking off of the question about the council committee, where that got to, that was sort of what I was circling around too, is how do you lock out heavily moneyed interests in the process? Because pretty much anything that goes through city council, right? I mean, you have to have the ability to show up at a hearing. Is that hearing going to be during normal business hours? Like, there's not that many people that can actually show up during normal business hours, but the people who can generally come from moneyed organizations that can send people to show up during normal business hours. So has, like the group you're part of, A More Just Chicago, or Civic Federation, have you guys given any thought on how to level the playing field in that way? Because without an active leveling, it feels mostly like we would let the process of how our elections locally play out, which, as you pointed out, is quite a sad state. It's very low turnout in a lot of cases, and most people don't pay attention. It would be letting that process play out for the formation of a charter, which, in my opinion, could lead to not a good result.
So what I'm hearing you raise, and these are all concerns. So look, on the basis of our history, there's more reasons to think this will be captured and basically be, a new form of the prevailing status quo that we've long dealt with. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try it. One. Two, some of the specific things that you're talking about, if the legislation was overly prescriptive, or to the degree to which the legislation creating the Charter Commission was prescriptive, it's actually preempting the capacity of the people to decide things for themselves. And so, as a matter of reform, as a matter of outcome, I'm very much aligned with you. But the question is that itself going to have legitimacy if it is not from an open process? As for the capture by special interests, I think there's ways of going about that. What actually are the requirements for getting on the ballot to be a charter commissioner? How are those elections going to be funded? These are real questions here that may determine capture. The one thing that was capture oriented that I did speak to is if we actually leave it open for the possibility that a mayor or the city council is the initiator, then it's basically letting the foxes into the hen house, right? And so it has to start with the people. If there is concern that the people will not sufficiently activate for purposes of taking back the government and actually having it be responsive to them, yeah, I don't know what to say about that. And yeah, those forces that you're talking about are going to be arrayed against this in some respect. However, I will say this. I think, prevailing status quo, power brokers, moneyed interests, so on and so forth, across the board, all the way to regular folks, I think everybody knows that the way things are working right now are problematic. And that, all of the talk about affordability, and affordability is a really important thing. When I look at affordability, the question that comes to mind for me, why aren't we talking about the affordability of government? Because we're paying a lot for it and not getting a heck of a lot in return right now, right? So we can't. This is the good thing and the bad thing about democracy. We really can't dictate to the people what it is that should be done, unless we want to become those that we're seeking to actually pull out of the system, or at least to modulate their influence and presence.
I know I had my chance, but can I just add one little sub-question to elaborate a little on what Eric's getting at? Because for me, the power brokers, moneyed interests, their opportunity is not at the Charter Commission. It's before that. If there's a public referendum or a legislation being debated, that's when they, whether it's Bring Chicago Home or the Fair Tax Initiative, that's when they flood the airwaves with lies that tell you, you know, we're going to tax your Social Security or whatever that lovely lady said that killed the fair tax. That was not true. That's where, how do you control, you can't control the public dialogue when the issue is on the table, but that's where they wield the most power. How do we get through that in order to get to the actual work that you're talking about?
Organize, organize, organize.
I think we have time for one more question if we want.
Thank you. Could you tell me who in the state legislature is taking the lead on this?
Cam Buckner.
Well, with that, we should belly up to the bar and take the conversation. Joe, will you hang out for a few minutes and talk to folks? You have time?
In the bar?
No, I think that's a yes.
I
All
think
right.
he's on.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.